Hey everybody, let's get some music on here.
Presenting Benny Goodman
There we
and his
are.
music.
Hey Gene. Evening Eric and Karen and Mona. I must finish making this drink.
Benny Goodman, ladies and gentlemen, the man with the torrid clarinet and,
And
even
even
more
more
torrid
torrid
band,
band.
who pervades its chorded rhythms, all danceable, in the urban room
All
of
right.
the Congress Hotel in
Where's the
Chicago.
rest of? Where's my?
And first of all, one of Irving Berlin's greatest hits, Blue Skies.
Where's? Place has been a mess a while. Here we are then. Evening, Kathleen, Dad, and Bob. Hey, back in Chicago. Good week for that. Hey, Kathleen and the Frozen Euphoniums. Hey, Carla, Jill, Keely, Heather, Katie, Marcia. Hey, everybody. I know I missed a few there while I was grabbing the materials to smoke this old-fashioned. There we go, man. Drinks are always better when you set fire to them, you know. Using this cool, mysterious Chicago glass that David sent. How about that? Hey, Floricita. Amazed that those of you who came to the lecture in person the other night are back again. It is a little bit different. I got a couple of different things. Hey, Donna in Frozen, Texas. Hope the power grid holds up all right. Glad it's good to hear that. I think that's out, like, this time next week. I forget what actual day. Yeah, fire, fire. Yeah. Burn. Hey, Kathleen. Hey, Elaine. Hey, Casey. That is delicious. Timberly, yeah, the dead ringers are about out of the woods now. It was touch and go. They had things packed just in case. Dad, yeah. Hey, Al over on YouTube in Milwaukee. I'm sure Miles will be here any minute now. Hey, Megan. Hey, Gail. See, if I try to work at my desk, Miles is right there. I couldn't even work on next week's tour because he kept walking all over the keyboard. Hey, Gail. Hey, Jeannie.
Benny Goodman presents Helen Ward singing With All My Heart.
Hey, Robert. Keeping it safe as we can, anyway. Hey, Amy. Well, it was a good trip. Hey, Cindy. And hey, Diane. Evening, everybody. I don't want to bring it up and like blame Frank or anything, but frankly, there actually were more people murdered at the Love Castle than there were in the Murder Castle. Hey, Shelby. Well, Octavia, if you call Taliesin a shack, kind of. Man, that place ain't 15 miles from nothing. Like, it's so far out I have to use double negatives. Evening, Evelyn. All I'll ever care for. I would write a song. Welcome along, everybody, wherever you happen to be joining us from right now. Night, tell the stars above you. Hey, Grandma Belle. Rita, I am presently having a smoked old-fashioned. Hey, Molly. Hey, Jeff. Listening and watching Young Frankenstein, okay. I guess we could do Puddin' on the Ritz. Welcome along, everybody.
Benny Goodman goes away back and gets a lot of rhythm.
Hey, Marie and Molly.
Jenny Walk. Benny Goodman and his orchestra.
Oh yeah, Bad Apple was terrific. Very good food there too. Hey, Lorena. I'll be back on Tuesday. Welcome along, everybody. Brand new tour tonight. First of 2 weeks in a row with brand new ones. Here's the guy. Whoa. Here, Miles. I'll just hold you up here, okay? No need to make a mess. Hey, Sarah. Miles. I better make him some room over here, I guess. Move my stuff around a bit. Hey, Laura. Yeah, Karen, that's why we're doing it here. And Miles looks unimpressed, but he just keeps coming back for more. Miles.
They all loved it. They all loved those bastards when they played by Benny Goodman. And now another one
Yep.
in the same vein. Rosetta.
Hey, Miles. Have a seat, okay? Just sit on down. All right, we'll let Benny Goodman do one more tune, then we'll get started up properly here. Hey, Angela. Hey, Linda. What? Miles? Miles? Hey, Vicky. Evening all around. You are in my world and welcome to it, as Thurber would say. Miles. Miles. You need to keep this pointed up, okay? If you need your head scratched, I'll scratch it. Here. Hey, Nancy. Miles. Miles. Miles! What have you done? Did you just take the chat away? Yes. Well, hey, Priya. It's a regular cat jamboree around here. Lily will generally not come into a room if Miles is there, but right about now they know they've got me outnumbered. Hey, Claudel. There, go see Priya. She's under the green chair, see? We're gonna let Benny Goodman finish up this tune. Then we'll get started properly. Welcome anybody new, especially. Miles? This is really kind of messing up my ability to handle things here, Miles. It really is. And Claudel, we're still here just about every Thursday. Okay, you're getting down now, okay? You got to get started. Well, here, I'll let you stay up for a second.
Music by Benny Goodman is being presented from the Joseph.
All right. Benny Goodman coming to you live from the Joseph Urban Room in the Congress Hotel in downtown Chicago. Time that we actually got started here. I'm Adam Seltzer from Mysterious Chicago Tours. I've been a tour guide and historian here in Chicago for 20 years now. I've got about a dozen Chicago history books out. Not to mention, notice I'm wearing a sweater today. 15 years old now, the Smart Alex Guide to American History shows on the cover Jimmy Carter wearing earmuffs. Famously told people to try to conserve energy and keep their houses cool. Hence the sweater, just because it is in fact actually rather chilly in my apartment tonight. We're going to say that that's a tribute to Jimmy Carter. But welcome along. I'm also in addition to running Mysterious Chicago Tours, I also wrote Mysterious Chicago, the book, H.H. Holmes, The True History of the White City Devil, Murder Maps USA, Graceland Cemetery, Chicago Stories, Symbols, and Secrets, and brand new one out next week, Graveyards of Trinity Church in St. Paul's, my first New York history book. I'm in New York a couple of months out of the year. I always wanted to contribute something to that great city, so this is going to be that. So what we're talking about today, though, is Frank Lloyd Wright and his assorted scandals, which turns out to be a very popular topic. I got a gig about a year ago doing Frank Lloyd Wright tours for groups that are coming through Chicago as part of like long road trips going to all the big Frank Lloyd Wright sites. I had to kind of brush up. Most of his stuff here in Chicago is in the suburbs, which makes it kind of out of my jurisdiction, but there was quite a bit out there. So what we're going to talk about today is I did find a lot of great stuff in the microfilm room about his various scandals, which as architects go, frankly, are not that bad. But turns out there's quite a market for these things. The other night, I did a talk for Chicagoans as part of their winter lecture series about Frank Lloyd Wright scandals, and they not only sold out, they had like something in the neighborhood of 200 people on the waiting list. So clearly you guys want to hear me bash Frank Lloyd Wright a little bit, and I'm only too happy to accommodate. So let's go ahead and get started in any case. Oh, totally the wrong button I hit right there. Okay, here we go. So in any case, I actually found a connection between these stories and Graveyards of Trinity Church in St. Paul. So this is Trinity Church in Lower Manhattan. old 18th century graveyard. One of the older graves is a guy by the name of Sidney Breeze. And this is rather difficult to read, of course. A lot of them are very difficult to read. But this one, what it says is, Sidney Breeze, made by himself. He wrote his own epitaph. That epitaph reads, Ha! Sidney, Sidney, liest thou here? I here lie, till time is flown to its extremity. You maybe had to be there, but I'm sure it made sense to him. Anyway, Sidney Breeze was a known party animal. He ran a mercantile shop somewhere in New York. I don't know where, because apparently he was so well known that he didn't have to put the address in any of his advertisements. But he was especially known for his taste in wine. He was always throwing elaborate parties, and he had a bullet in his body from a duel when he was a young man. These guys in this graveyard were really, really into dueling. I don't know what the duel was about. I assume it was something stupid. It was usually something stupid. And it's not like in the movies where you walk 10 paces, then spin around and shoot. They just stood there facing each other and took turns shooting most of the time. People were genuinely weird individuals. But in any case, Sidney Breeze had a great-grandson named James Lawrence Breeze, shown here smoking what I'm sure is only harmless tobacco. However, James Lawrence Breeze in 1895 hosted a dinner that came to be known as the Pie Girl Dinner. This was a dinner that featured several architects, several artists, in which a pie opened up and a 16-year-old girl jumped out. This is a highly sanitized version of what happened. Most of the early accounts say that she was wearing black gauze. Later accounts leave out the black gauze. Among the people present were Augustus St. Gaudens, who did this, a subject of this portrait by Anders Zorn with one of his models back behind him. She seems more into it than he does. Also present, well, this is the thing, when these stories about this thing broke out, the lesson here is architects were a bunch of freaks. 1970s rock stars have nothing on 1890s architects. 1830s theater people are far beyond everybody else, but still. This is Charles Bowler Atwood, who was brought in by Daniel Burnham to replace John Wellborn Root, was 3 hours late to their first meeting, and that kind of set the standard for how he would operate. Brilliant architect, did things like the Fisher Building, the Museum of Science and Industry, dozens of buildings around Chicago in just a short career here, when he showed up at all, because more often than not, he was off in an opium den someplace. Then when he died, his wife showed up, and everyone said, he doesn't have a wife. He's a well-known club man. A man about town. Also, he had a wife back in New York. This is the Pleasure Dome of Benjamin Marshall, the architect who designed, say, the Drake Hotel, the Steger Building here in Chicago. His swimming pool was particularly famous because he was known to loan people bathing suits without telling them that they were going to dissolve in water. Now, people usually showered before they got in the pool in those days, so they were probably saved further embarrassment. This can at least be traced back to a Chicago Magazine article from 1929. But people who have studied him said, yes, you cannot imagine what went on in that studio/party palace on the border between Evanston and Wilmette. But this brings us all to Frank Lloyd Wright and his Love Castle, which was called a menace to the morals of the community by the same newspapers that called him an insane menace back in 1911. So we're going to leave some of the regular autobiographical stuff out because I want to save it for next week. We're going to do a regular Frank Lloyd Wright architecture tour next week. But this week we're talking about the scandals. We do have to get started anyway. This is W.W. Boyington's Wells Street Railroad Station, which stood right where the Merchandise Mart is today. So, Frank Lloyd Wright arrived here, according to his autobiography, in early 1887. A cold winter night in 1887. It was a night just like tonight. Stepping off the train without telling his parents where he was going, or his mother anyway, he walked off with $7 in his pockets, promptly spent one of them to see the ballet Seba, and two more on his hotel room, then went from architect to architect to architect, looking for work and being turned away everywhere, until finally Joseph Lyman Silsby took pity on him and gave him a job for $8 a week. That's the way he says it in his autobiography, which is usually code for don't listen to a word of it. I mean, nowadays we can look up and see that Seba was not running in Chicago in the winter of 1887. It would have been several months before. He also conveniently doesn't mention that he probably already had arrangements with Silby. He had worked with him a bit on Unity Temple up in Wisconsin. But Frank Lloyd Wright arrived around 1886 or 87, and soon was posing for portraits like this one in 1887. Now, this was taken at Commodore Steffen's place in the South Loop. That was where you went to get your picture taken if you were, say, Marshall Field or Bertha Palmer. You can see the Steffens logo right there. Where he even got the money for this is anybody's guess. He certainly wasn't quite as hard up as he claimed to be in his autobiography later on. You know, artists make up backstories for themselves all the time. But working for Silsby, he also met a guy by the name of Cecil Corwin. This is them in 1888. That's Frank on the left. That's Cecil on the right. This is, I believe they're posing for the cover of the Cult of Victorian Male Friendship magazine, which later became, well, we don't know for sure, Quarterly. Recent scholarship, there was recently a book suggesting that Cecil, at least, was very much into Frank Lloyd Wright, and Frank might have been fairly receptive, though it wasn't long after this that he got married to Catherine. But he worked for Silsby for a while before getting a job in the Borden Block. Now, the Borden Block was a place right across from the Delaware Building. Like, the other side of this street would be the Alley of Death and Mutilation if you go on ghost tours. So, Dearborn and Randolph. But this was the office of Sullivan and Adler. Very big architecture firm at the time. But according to Wright, he was very unpopular with the other draftsmen there, partly because they were all Jewish. Frank had some issues with that. In his autobiography, he describes the crowd around him in the office as a noisy crowd. To the right, Eisendrath, apparently stupid and Jewish. Behind me to the left, Oppenheimer, a Jew too. Isbell, a Jew? Waitert, Jew undoubtedly. Several more Jewish faces because Adler himself must be a Jew. Now, he came to think that they were all resentful and even had a knife fight with Henry Oppenheimer. Now, the way he describes it, Oppenheimer leaped at him holding a paper slicer. It was basically a sword fight. He described Oppenheimer as a heavy-bodied, short-legged, pompadoured, conceited, red-faced Jew. His face as red as a turkey cock's wattles. And when he attacked him, he emitted a peculiar animal scream like a Japanese mad with sake. So I was able to dig up a picture of Henry Oppenheimer. Here's that terrifying fellow. He looks like he's posing for a jar of salve or something. Oppenheimer's old-fashioned ointment. But he worked there for a while and started doing some bootleg houses on the side, and then eventually broke off on his own, moving into the Garrick Theater building next door. His first big commission was for Mr. Winslow out here in River Forest. And in short order, he was picking up other things like, there's a guy named Nathan Greer Moore. We'll talk a bit more about him next week. We'll cover a little more of these next week. But he built a house for him over in Oak Park, right across the street from his own eventual studio. And the Frank Lloyd Thomas house down the road, which as early as 1905, neighbors were referring to as the harem. It had this Moorish design that they associated with harems. There was a write-up of it in an architectural magazine that mentioned, this is a fairly interesting piece. Of course, it is pure ridiculousness, but Wright's later work is far saner and loses none of the artisticness, which as these things go. As far as these early stories go, we do know that the knife fight thing was true. George Elmsley, the architect, wrote to Frank when the autobiography came out, just kind of taking him to task, saying, why did you even tell that story? Apparently it was actually true, unlike a lot of other things in the autobiography, but it stands to reason that he would want to tell these stories, not the stories that other people remembered about him, like people who took pity on him because he looked like he needed lunch and took him out to lunch, only to have him order really, really expensive mushrooms, the fanciest thing on the menu at the time. Or the time that they loaned him money for train fare because he was desperate, then he came back in 10 minutes saying, I spent it all on Japanese prints, can you loan me more train fare? There were a lot of stories like this. Frank made pretty good money at different times, but he tended to spend it faster than he was making it. But as his career took off, he had a meeting with Daniel Burnham. At least, once again, according to his autobiography. In this meeting, Daniel Burnham sat him down and said, Wright, you've got a lot of talent, but you really need more classical training. If you will agree to go to l'École des Beaux-Arts in France and go there for 3 years, I will take care of your family, And when you come back, I will make you a partner. You'll become a wealthy architect. You just have to give up all of this creativity and individuality. To which Wright said, but I can't give up individuality. That is the way that he told the story anyway. There is no other source of this meeting happening. Really, this is just Wright writing up his own version of the temptation of Christ on the mountain, which you see associated in heroic literature all over the place, like when Vader says, Luke, join me. Together we will rule the galaxy as father and son, if only you give up this rebel alliance. Or in the next movie, when Palpatine says, Luke, join me at your father's, take your father's place at my side. This is really just writing up a heroic story for himself. There's no other source on this, even though it gets written up all the time. So, meanwhile, we're going to go back to 1905 a little bit. There was an architect by the name of Stanford White in New York, at the firm of McKim, Mead, and White, who in 1905, back before, it was 1901, he had an affair with Evelyn Nesbit, who was a chorus girl at the time. He took her back to his apartment, drugged her, and that began what was about a 6-month affair. That's a very nice word for it. She was about 16, he was 48. Then in 1905, she was married to a guy by the name of Harry Thaw, who also wasn't great. We can see here that nobody ever tried to defend Stanford White. But Harry Thaw found out what had happened back in those days and murdered Stanford White. He shot him in the back at Madison Square Garden, which he had designed. And this became one of the various things that they called the trial of the century over time. And eventually Harry Thaw got off on grounds of insanity. But by this time, a lot of stories got rehashed, like stories about how White had debauched all kinds of women who were even younger than her. Thaw had been sending spies out to him to report back on his orgies, as you see here. Horrible story of how White debauched girls told by Mrs. Thaw, and you can see down below on the column there, even talked about his boasts of going to the Pie Girl dinner back in 1895. This came up quite a lot. You can see the list of the people who were invited to this. McKim, Mead, and White were all present. So this was a huge newspaper story, one of those trial of the century things, and it reminded newspaper reporters that people like to buy stories about architects being freaks, and it reminded people that architects were a bunch of freaks. So we'll move up to 1909 here. Now, Frank was married to a woman named Catherine. They had met when she was 16 and Frank was about 19. They married just after her 18th birthday. She gave birth to 7 children. They were living in Oak Park when Frank designed this house for Edwin Cheney. We'll spin around to it a bit. Just a few blocks away, about 6 blocks away from the Oak Park house. See, even down below, it even had some Christmas lights up. Still, when I went to film. But Edwin was married to a woman named Mamah Cheney. Mamah Borthwick Cheney had a couple of kids of their own, but she and Frank fell in love. And in 1909, Frank decided to give up his practice for a while and go to Europe to promote his interests over there, leaving his various people in the field like Drummond and Griffin and Mahoney and Amberg and all of these people there to finish up the commissions themselves. And when they went off to Europe together, they sat down with their spouses and said, listen, we have fallen in love. We're going to go to Europe, and we promise we'll try to break up. But in a year, if we are still in love and this is real, we're going to want divorces. And Frank said, I'll keep on paying all of your expenses no matter what happens. So as far as they were concerned, they were doing everything just about right. But newspapers had just been reminded that architects were freaks. Hence, this whole article. Leave families, elope to Europe. Architect Frank Lloyd Wright and Mrs. Edwin H. Cheney of Oak Park startle friends. Abandoned wife loyal. Spouse victim of a vampire, she says. This was Catherine's opinion for years, that he's just been seduced by this other woman and sooner or later he'll come to his senses. So this was the front page of the Chicago Tribune. It was also on the front page of the Chicago Journal at the time, talking about the first picture of his Oak Park soulmate. The mentions here that the spouses were going to forgive the two affinities. Now, this is, I think, part of why the story took off like it did. Frank was not exactly famous at the time. This should not have been a front page story. But you can see over on the left here is this other headline, Her Death Up to Me, Clemenson. This was a high-profile supposed murder case that happened in Rogers Park that occupied days of space in the papers, and all revolved around this guy, Dr. Clemenson, having other girlfriends that were referred to in the press as affinities. That was the word of the year. They loved using the word affinities, and having a chance to use it again about an architect was too much to resist, at least for a day or so. There's also buried on another page of another paper the next day was talking about what they were always calling this trip a spiritual hegira. So this was really only a 1 or 2 day story at the time, but it was on the front page of a lot of papers. And it's worth noting that before this, Frank Lloyd Wright was really not famous. He got mentioned as an architect in articles about this new thing that was happening in Chicago, but he was usually just a list of the names. But you can see here, 1909, mentions of him in the press really spike. And this 1906 spike over here is just because he went to Buffalo for a little while, and the Society column was really busy there, mentioned him 5 or 6 times. But in any case, this was about a 1-day story. While he was out, other people in the office kept on working, like William Drummond designed this place. Next door was one by Isabel Roberts. Now, Isabel Roberts, this is officially a Frank Lloyd Wright building, but Roberts is often said to have designed it herself. She was officially an office worker. Different documents say different things, but later she did become an architect in her own right. And I really like this house, too. You can see up above, like a tree kind of grows through the roof. Also, John Van Bergen had just joined the firm at the time. I love this one up not too far away from where the Benjamin Marshall studio would have been. This is a George Washington Maher. Walter Burley Griffin designed these twin houses in Rogers Park, not too far from some Wright buildings. And Walter Burley Griffin eventually married Marion Mahoney, the first woman to be licensed as an architect in Illinois, who did a lot of these paintings of Wright buildings as Japanese landscapes, which, as much as anything else, when we think of Frank Lloyd Wright architecture, we think of paintings like this. This is what cemented this as his style in people's minds. As for Marion herself's opinion of Frank Lloyd Wright, she called him a canker sore who originated very little but spent most of his time claiming everything and swiping everything, whose vanity and malice killed the so-called Chicago movement. All right. Now, the story was only in the papers for about a day, but then 6 months later, newspapers figured out where Edwin Cheney was. He was going to be giving Mama a divorce after all, though Catherine wasn't keen on going along with this. But the story is mostly out of the news. Mid-1910, Frank Lloyd Wright came back to town, finding that his firm wasn't rolling in the bucks for the family like he thought, so he started going back to work trying to get more commissions. He still insisted, no, I'm not back living with my wife or anything. I'm just here as a benefactor and trying to make more money for her. But also was building Taliesin, a hillside retreat up in Spring Green, Wisconsin, about 15 miles from anywhere. 30 miles from anywhere back then. But then, 1911, November of 1911, it was announced that he was designing a brand new hotel for Lake Geneva. 1 month later, word came out that he was up at Taliesin and that Mama was living there with him, even though he had not been divorced yet and Mama was not his wife. He was living with a woman that he wasn't married to, which by today's standards was not particularly shocking. But Christmas Eve of 1911, the Inner Ocean published this. Newspaper reporters found out what was going on, and especially people in Spring Green found out what was going on. So this became front page news. This is a couple of days later. Mob perils Wright and affinity. Now, this is the afternoon edition. They had to be living under guard at this point because so many people from Spring Green were talking about tar and feathers. So Frank made a point of saying, if I had just gone to Reno and gotten a piece of paper, this wouldn't be an issue, which is a fair point. In those days, divorce was a lot harder to get. I don't think it was quite as uncommon or as big of a social shock as people make it out to be, but there were only a couple of grounds on which you could get a divorce in most states. No-fault divorce wouldn't come until the 1970s. About the only thing you could do was go to Nevada. Nevada offered many more grounds for divorce than other people, but you had to live there for 6 months first. Eventually, they lowered it down to 3 months, so people were like living in bunks for a while just until they could get a divorce. So we got to talk a little bit about the Chicago American here, this newspaper. The Chicago American had their first edition come out around noon every day. And if the news was big enough, they'd have a new edition and an extra edition about every 45 minutes or so. Now, the Chicago Tribune had interviewed Wright on Christmas Day, came out on the 26th, and he starts out being all right in the interview. He says, "Mrs. Wright has a soul of her own. It is not for me to say what she will do." Okay, Frank, very modern, really. But then he just had to wreck it. He said, "As for the general aspect of this thing, I want to say this. Laws and rules are made for the average. The ordinary man cannot live without rules to guide his conduct. It is infinitely more difficult to live without rules, but that is what the really honest, sincere, and thinking man is compelled to do. And I think when a man has displayed some spiritual power, has given concrete evidence of his ability to see and feel the higher and better things of life, we ought to go slow in deciding he has acted badly." In other words, wow, what a douchebag. Most of the points he's making underneath it, yeah, the marriage had fallen apart, these things happen. But then he just has to make the point in about the douchiest way possible. This guy really, really needed some media training. But this became something. This is in the 7th edition of the Chicago American on the 27th. Frank saying, "I am no man's husband," with the eternal triangle in the middle there. Move on to another one, 7th home edition, the next day. First photograph published of the Love Castle, as they were calling Taliesin. And the word was coming in that Sheriff Pengali was going to be arresting him by midnight. So the next day, but by the 8th edition, Frank is waiting for the sheriff to show up. Word is they're going to flee at any second. 9th edition, still ready to flee. Sporting edition usually means that's when the sports scores had came in. It would be about the only thing different from the 8th edition most of the time. Then on the inside of this, they've got this fantastic illustration of Wright and Mama going to the place, of the neighbors getting ready to tar and feather somebody, and Sheriff Pengali. It's as close as we'll get to a picture of Sheriff Pengali running them off, and Frank himself running after newspaper reporters with an iron bar, which he was doing. They were showing up, and he was like waving iron bars around at them, demonstrating a Chapel Rowan level of lack of media training. So all of this comes down to Sheriff Pengali. What you can see here is what Bill Pengali, some sheriff, thinks of the spiritual Hejira. Now, Sheriff Pengali was a farmer by trade. His father had been sheriff for a year, about 20 years before. Sheriff was an elected position of Iowa County at the time. In his various newspaper articles, well, this one in particular in the Chicago Evening American, he talks like a sheriff from a 1970s sheriffsploitation, one of those drive-in movies that's all like sheriffs, alligators, and boobs. Guys like this, or this, or this, or this. In the interview, he said, "Whether there is I'm trying to do his voice as well as I can. Whether there is anything wrong there or not, I swan I don't know. It's just as bad for the community's morals to have everybody suspecting something is going on as if it was going on. Mr. Wright is a nice chap, but he doesn't belong out here. He belongs in the city where there ain't nobody hurt by such goings on. Why, you know, he has 4 bathtubs in that house that folks say he built for that woman. Now, what in tarnation can 2 folks want of 4 bathtubs on Saturday night?" And I always said that to say this properly, you need to have suspenders on. You must hook both thumbs into your suspenders. Say, now, what in tarnation? It probably takes a little bit of work to figure out exactly which syllables to push the suspenders out on. But the reporter told the sheriff, "Well, artists, you know, are different. Besides, they're on a spiritual Hejira." To which Pengali replied, "Well, I don't care particular how many bathtubs they've got, but so long as Bill Pengali's sheriff of Iowa County, there ain't going to be no Hejiras here. Nope, nor she-Jiras either." I looked and looked to find a photo of Sheriff Bill Pengali. I did not find one. However, I found one of his son from the 1950s. which suggests that he looked quite a bit like Biff Tannen from Back to the Future. Now, he pointed out that he didn't really have any grounds for a warrant. There was nothing actually illegal going on there, but he would have been within his powers to just go up to Taliesin and said, all right, why don't you make like a tree and get out of here? Anybody home, Lloyd Wright? So, now the next year the Mann Act would come into effect, making it illegal to take a woman across straight lines for immoral purposes. He could have been arrested on those grounds. And in the 1920s, he actually briefly was arrested on those grounds, but that was a whole other thing. And nearly was in 1915 as well. But as all of this was going on, Chicago architects pointed out that Wright was not personally particularly popular. And Wright started issuing more statements that were issued a little bit more carefully word-wise. Things were coming out like this in his own story. Said, "To live a lie is worse than to violate a convention. I am living in violation of the convention and the law. I am at the mercy of newspaper commentators, but I am living the truth. No, I am not a rich man. I have never heard of a rich architect. All I have in the world is what I made in my profession. I shall live truth as I see it. The life of the soul is not yet amenable to written laws." It's just bizarre that someone would actually say this stuff out loud. But the Chicago Daily American, for one, was not quite convinced. You can see right here, that same issue, they published this cartoon of him and Mae McChaney up at Taliesin with a rifle shooting at the Ten Commandments. All right, so nothing really came of this. Again, there was nothing technically illegal going on there. It's not illegal to have 4 bathrooms for 2 people, yet. But part of why nothing really happened and the tar and feather parties stopped being talked about was it was just too cold. The temperature got down to about 30 below. There was a blizzard. It would have been very hard for the sheriff even to get to Taliesin, let alone any of the villagers to get to Taliesin. So the whole thing just kind of fizzled out of the press after about a week or so. So Frank went back to work. We're jumping ahead a little bit in the timeline here, but a few years later he designed the Bach House in Chicago. We saw that this morning on the morning mini tour. And of course, my favorite thing about the Bach House is the plaque in front of it, which mentions that the inward orientation of the house ensures the privacy of its residents and reflects Wright's idea of the importance of family life. For other people, anyway. I don't want to make too much out of this being a scandal, but about 2 years later, in August of 1914, a man named Julian Carlton, a recently fired servant at Taliesin, there's no right way to say it. He set fire to the place, attempted to kill himself, and eventually murdered 7 people, primarily with an axe. He died himself a few weeks later and was never in good enough shape to explain what was on his mind or what he was trying to do here. But this is it happened on August the 15th, and it actually made the Chicago Daily News, an evening paper, in their 10th edition that day. You can see it's still fighting for space with World War I news, but they were already able to get pictures in and everything. At this point, they only have about 3 people murdered. It would eventually the tally would go up to 7. And the next day, the Chicago Evening American, that same day, managed to slip something out in its last War Extra edition, the 10th, but all they have really is just the headline on top. There's no other story in it. Just kills 3 in Love House. Next issue, they were able to get out a couple hours later. A little more details. They got a picture down there. They've got the whole article about it. Next day, the Chicago Tribune, still fighting with war news, but does have an also awful crime in Wisconsin Cottage and Frank Lloyd Wright's name right there in the headline. The day after that, once again, still fighting for war news, but up above, terrible tragedy at Love Cottage. This is the thing, the story was not as big a deal as you might expect for something this shocking and somebody who had just been in the news that much just for living there. But this was really just a 1 or 2 day story in most papers. It barely came up again after this in most of them. Though about 3 days later, the Chicago Record-Herald did publish this whole article, "The End of Lawless Loves." They wrote, "Violent and lawless loves have violent and lawless ends. An old Greek dramatist would have said that the insane servant was the instrument of the gods for avenging the violence of the decency-defying adventure. Those who believe that the moral verities still exist would find in that tragic confirmation confirmation of the truth that wages of sin are death." Really showing a remarkable lack of sensitivity for all 7 people being murdered, but especially 6 of them were not involved in these lawless loves. But just about a few months after this, Frank was absolutely distraught. He and Edwin Cheney, apparently by chance, ended up on the same train going up to Wisconsin, and they casually sat and discussed what the arrangements would be. But over the course of the next year, Frank was splitting his time between rebuilding Taliesin up north and back down in Chicago, living at this house on 25 East Cedar, which was torn down just about 10 years ago. So just a few months after the attacks, while Frank was still grieving, he got a letter from Miriam Noel saying she had just been devastated by a breakup herself and wrote him a huge sympathy letter. She went to visit him on Christmas Eve, the 3-year anniversary of the story breaking that he was living in Taliesin with Mama. And the very next day, she wrote him a letter that made it pretty clear that they did it on the first date. She essentially threw herself at him, and he was quite receptive. Now, this is one, Catherine Wright described Mama as a vampire. You could have a lot easier time calling Miriam a vampire, Miriam Noel. The next morning she wrote him a letter that said, "Lord of my waking dreams, I have thee friend who art my master. Let me crowd your head with a wreath of violets like Alcibiades at the feast of Agathon. You have touched me with the edge of the far outspreading wing of love, and I kiss your feet with my trembling lips. I am your prisoner." So yeah, they were pretty clearly doing it. And Frank was so enamored that he was overlooking obvious signs that she was not only really into drugs, but also really not mentally stable. But she was living with him at Taliesin by spring, even though she hated it there. And I don't really think that she's been studied in as much depth as you would think. She mostly appears in novels more than anything else. She published a serialized autobiography that is almost never actually cited. She was a sculptress, told all these stories about hanging out with Trotsky over in Europe. But she hated it at Taliesin, partly because of what had happened there. And soon she was writing him all of these letters, breaking up with him and claiming that he was too distant, then taking him back, and then yelling at him again. One of them wrote that a small, narrow mind could suppose that somebody was endeavoring to possess him, because she loved him and depended on his loyalty and affection. I suppose this morning you were walking to and fro, wrapped in admiration of yourself and your house, uttering high-sounding praises on freedom, denouncing your marriage, morality, and family to the admiration of yourself and your housekeeper. But meanwhile, Frank was already writing to his son that Miriam was making his life a living hell. And after he fired his housekeeper, Nellie Breen, she leaked a whole bunch of letters that Miriam had written to various newspapers. And by this time, the two of them were back together. They were mostly breakup letters, but Chicago American got a number of quotes. A rep for the Chicago Republican Women's Association said, "Mrs. Noel is ensnared by the hypnotic spell of this man, who must be both captivating and repulsive." A woman from the Bureau of Public Welfare said, "Mr. Wright and Mrs. Noel are two of the worst criminals in society. They have a code of their own, which is not the code that should govern all men and women. It is destruction, and they will reap its whirlwind." A lawyer named Florence King said, "You cannot defy convention and custom and get away with it." Frank said, "Why am I tied to this provincial whipping post? Why is my home at the mercy of scandalmongers? What has been most precious to me has been flung underfoot to gratify the man on the street." But the letters did get published. I don't know if all of them got published. There's some of them that might have been too hot for the press. Several of Miriam's letters I know are on file among the Wright papers at Columbia University in New York, but they never seem to get cited other than just the occasional excerpt where she calls him Lord of my waking dreams. There are a few from the next week that I'm guessing are equally juicy, but I'd have to go to New York to see them. Probably accomplish that this spring. So by this time, they were back together anyway, and there's just one suggestion in the letters that really does suggest that maybe Wright was up to more than this. Because really, when you look at these scandals, it's nothing like Stanford White. It's nothing like a lot of these other architects who were involved in much shadier dealings, just weren't quite as verbose about it. But in one of them, she says, "Your carnivals at Taliesin are not for me. I do not want to be in them, nor do I wish to be told of them. A merry party of debauchers using your house for purposes too shocking for words, invited for that purpose. My suffering is too intense to be described, but that doesn't matter either. Only one thing matters, that you be entertained." So this is a hint that there may have been much worse going on here that we know of, which I tend to believe just because dude was an architect. Now, I'm going to go back a little bit here before we wrap this up. This is how I always wrap up my Wright presentations. You saw this article earlier, the headline, "Wright Insane Menace," says Spring Green Paper. It mentions in this that this newspaper believes that this escapade will give the architect more advertising than his knee panties, long hair, and other funny ways ever could. Which is true. This did give him way more publicity than it ever had before. But, with all this talk about his funny ways and his funny way of dressing and his long hair, I can think of another guy who had long hair and some weird ideas, and he didn't always do what people thought was right. And Willie Nelson has remained consistently popular for many years. So, all right, everybody, next week we will do a more straight-up Frank Lloyd Wright talk where we don't look at the newspaper accounts of his personal life so much as at his actual architecture around the Chicagoland area. That'll be next week, same bat time, same bat channel. Thursday night. Tomorrow's Find a Grave Friday. If you're new around here, every morning we do a virtual tour for 5, 10, 15 minutes at the Mysterious Chicago Facebook page. Friday is Find a Grave Friday, where I go to a cemetery where I know a particular person is buried, but I don't look up what the grave looks like or where exactly it is within the cemetery. We play hot and cold until I find it. Sometimes it takes us a while. Sometimes it's pretty quick, sometimes it can take a while, and today I actually know who I'm going to be finding tomorrow. So everybody, thanks a lot for joining me. I will put up all of the information here for suggested donations. Thanks a lot. We'll put the Benny Goodman back on. We will just hang out like we always do. Thanks, everybody. Brand new tour.
And now Benny Goodman's arrangement of the Bugle Call Rang.
I know Willie Nelson was not an architect, but he had long hair and some weird ideas. He didn't always think what people think was right. The joke is it's supposed to sound like I'm about to talk about Jesus there. But the best version of that joke is still The Simpsons, where and that guy's name was... Oh, Marge, you know who I'm talking about. He used to drive that blue car. I gotta wonder what Frank Lloyd Wright would have thought of marijuana. Yeah, the Patreon at different tiers, there are things 4 times a week that come up there, including stuff that I get out of the microfilm room or the legal archives, especially on the serial killer tier, the stuff you don't get anywhere else. Yeah, Susan, I only got up through 1911 in this one. No, 1915 with Miriam. But I am kind of curious to see those other letters from her. Yeah, Mike, I would recommend the House on the Rock over it. I haven't been to Taliesin, actually. I've been by it, but I was just going to House on the Rock on the effing Chicago road trip a couple years ago. We stayed at the Don Q Inn, which is one of those hotels where they have theme rooms, which I thought was only on sitcoms. I had booked for myself the Castle Room, which was definitely actually the Dungeon Room. FLW experiment with social drugs, says Susan. Interesting. But House on the Rock, there's just no way to describe it to people that will really prepare them for what you're going to experience at House on the Rock. See you, Cindy. Yeah, I feel that went okay. It's always kind of nerve-wracking the first time I do a new tour. I've got like 70 of them here now.
Now, the popular tune, Thanks a Million.
But ones that I've never done virtually, who knows what's going to happen, you know. I haven't done Wright tours enough that I'm not usually checking my cheat sheets. Casey Christie, no, Jabba's palace is more of a Frank Lloyd Wright design than the Death Star. Arguably Vader's Bast Castle. It looks more like... Yeah, Vader's castle kind of looks like the Century City design, the Illinois building, the Frank design. We'll talk about that next week. I reverence both Vader and Palpatine, tempting Luke the same way Daniel Burnham allegedly tempted Frank Lloyd Wright. This is the scene where Burnham says, "But a million's not cool. You know what's cool? A billion." Other Mephistopheles scenes, you know. Gate of the Tilius and Fellowship is a whole other thing. Again, well, most of his scandals really just relate to being a jerk more than anything else. And his buildings being broadly unlivable.
Down Harlem Way, they're all trucking. And here's Helen Ward to tell you all about her. Trucking.
All right. Be yourself, Bob. I'll see you soon. Interested to see the new haircut. Kristen, definitely figure that out. All over town. Thank you, Ellen. Yeah, I see we got a chance of snow tomorrow. More of it down, not as much as they're getting in, like, Alabama and Georgia. You do get snow there occasionally. Just stay off the roads, because even if you know how to drive there, drive in the snow, the other people there do not. Casey, yes, architects would have fit right in at Mos Eisley. That wretched hive of scum and villainy.
Benny Goodman presents On the Alamo.
I've taken a couple of school groups to the Oak Park studio. They leave out a lot. But the last guy showed us like the 1907 equivalent of a conversation pit. I said, because, they didn't have boom boxes back then. like, did they have VCRs at least? Dude, you have not updated your pattern in a long time, have you? I remember being in the South and trying to explain to people, you slow down and you ease into your brake. That's how you drive on the ice. But the notion of slowing down to below the speed limit, even if there's not a lot of other cars around, just would not compute. I'm even going to be traveling around a little bit this weekend to get some more footage of Wright buildings to talk about next week. As good a reason as any to do a road trip is checking out all of an architect's work. I don't like having too much of an agenda when I travel, but I like to have some kind of goalpost, something that I want to see. Usually a concert. Chris, I don't know. It's just, I don't put that much thought into picking the typesetting. It comes in templates. Next year I'll try to remember to have larger numbers. Remind me around late November. Make a note of it. Ask your AI personal assistant to remind you in late November. They won't. But weed shops are everywhere now. It is a fad that will fade away. So, I remember when baseball card shops were everywhere. Most proliferations of shops are fads that will fade away someday. Eventually, big marijuana will absorb them all. Well, Susan, next week I'm primarily doing the stuff that I cover on my bus tours. It'll be a virtual version of my bus tours. Smoking banana peels, all right. And you'll dance to anything. If he hollers, let it go, let it fly away. Yeah, Danielle, I've been hearing some stuff about scandalous goings-on at Taliesin among, academia and stuff recently, but, I just kind of avoid it. Susie, you know the hell of it is I just can't find a lot of interesting stuff about the Robies, I don't think. I'm a little drunk, so I might just be forgetting something that I've got on them. But when I take Frank Lloyd Wright groups around, they're on like day 7 of a 2-week Frank Lloyd Wright road trip, so I feel like my job is to find stuff they don't already know, and they probably know a lot. But they probably haven't looked up the people who commissioned it. And some of them are very interesting. Others are kind of like Jeremiah Price. They're interesting mainly in it that they're so boring that it becomes interesting. I would like to come up with a New York trip for all the Mysterians. I'm not sure if it's the kind of thing you can do just once or twice and make money on. The insurance will kill you. Now, Katie, it's not that they don't know this at these museums. They know. And generally, they don't mind you ripping on Frank Lloyd Wright as a human being, as long as you don't knock his architecture at all. Which I'll do, but... Oh, crap, it's today. Opposite day. I always miss opposite day. It always sneaks up on me. Octavio, I've done that. There's a brothel time travel pub crawl up in the deck. How much more can I have to drink? Yeah. Octavia, it's kind of like an after-hours time travel pub crawl. Yeah, I've only done it once, I think. Maybe twice. We'll get to it soon, I guess. It's that time of the year. Right now I'm doing 2 new ones in a row. Eventually we'll get up to having 100 of these things in rotation. Alright, Benny's wrapping up. I'll play you guys the song I've been working on after this. If you stick around this long, you deserve to hear a brand new song, I suppose.
We have been presenting the music of Benny Goodman and his orchestra from the Joseph Urban Room of the Congress Hotel on Michigan Avenue in Chicago. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
NBC. The National Broadcasting Company. All right. So that's that. I promise this. I'm drunk enough to try it. This is a song about people who post on Facebook about what things were like for their generation. I'm still working on the title. I haven't found just the right last name. Tony Musselwhite rides in on his vintage big wheel trike. He rewinds in cursive, just the way we like. Whoa, babe, Tony Musselwhite. Tony only dresses up in gnarly neon clothes. He never locks his back door, and he only drinks from the hose. Whoa, babe, Tony Musselwhite. Tony never hits the bars, he says those days are gone. He know it's time to come back home when the street lights come on. Whoa, babe, Tony Musselwhite. Whoa, babe, Tony Musselwhite. Based on all those, every day you see a post on Facebook, in my generation, we had to drink, we never locked the hose, and we drank from the back door, and we rewound our Ataris in cursive until it was time for the creek to come on. And that could be either the boomers or Gen X. The gnarly neon clothes, locks it into my generation, though. So, I don't think Musselwhite is a funny enough last name for this. I tried Finkelstein, but it wasn't working. But all right, everybody, thank you very much. I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago Tours. I will see you all tomorrow for Find a Grave Friday. And until then, stay safe, stay strong, and of course, if at all possible, stay spooky, everybody.